Good morning and welcome back to another We Are Sunderland morning briefing. We've got a big bonanza for you this morning. We're going to do a bit of a season review, a Sunderland season where it all went wrong. So first of all, before we get stuck into things, our season ticket Black Cats Bar competition, we're going to extend that for another 2 weeks because we've had loads of interest in that. So if you haven't yet subscribed, head over to We Are Sunderland. It's just £1 to subscribe and you get 6 months worth of quality content in return. We are in partnership with Cospex Opticians and the Farm Museum. Gents, how are you doing?
All good. Thanks, Matty.
Yeah, not bad.
We're gonna relive some of the highlights of last season. So before we get stuck into things, I think it's probably fair that we touch on the last game one final time, and it just sort of epitomised the season as a whole, didn't it?
Yeah, it did for me. There was, like we spoke about on Monday, didn't we? There was nothing at all, to be honest. I know Sunderland ended up having a couple of good chances in the game, but I just reiterate what I said then. It just didn't ever feel like they were going to get back into that game when Sheffield Wednesday won it. Sheffield Wednesday were comfortable in it. They had the bit between the teeth. They obviously had something to play for with, and they needed it as well, the way results went in terms of staying up. Sunderland, it was just a case of pretty much copy and paste from what we've seen over the last couple of months. We've seen some boring performances. It was probably arguably better than the Millwall game or the Bristol. Not the Bristol game, but certainly the Millwall one. But I mean, you're clutching at straws really if you're trying to spin positives from it. It was just another really, really poor afternoon, and sort of, like I say, epitomised what's happened to Sunderland over the course of the last couple of months.
Yeah, I mean, I'd go to you for the same sort of question, Scott, but I'll save you the mercy of that. We'll take things back to the start of the season and the transfer window, because for a lot of people, that's, this is where the crux of the problem lies, and it's where things, maybe the foundations that they've laid. We were just talking before we came on there about obviously recruitment, etc., and something we've spoken about all year. So yeah, I mean, for me personally, that's where a lot of the problems lie. You've lost a lot of experienced players. You've brought in inexperienced players who aren't proven at this level, and for me, that just sort of set the tone. I mean, I don't know what you think.
I think if we're going to talk about Sunderland's season and everything that went on with it, and I kind of wrote this in the season review we did in the Echo. I think the starting point has to be that press conference that we did with Tony Mowbray underneath the bowels of Kenilworth Road after the playoff semi-final, because that really was the starting point for everything that then unravelled and unfolded from there. It was crystal clear at the time that there were major tensions between Mowbray and Speakman and Louis Dreyfus and the rest of the recruitment operation. We know the Farioli links had been there. All of that was bubbling along in the background. It clearly wasn't right. So the issue in the summer was going to be, firstly, is Tony Mowbray going to stay as the head coach? Well, we know he did. Second, then, is there going to be a shift in policy to reflect the worries, concerns, frustrations that Mowbray clearly had last season? Well, that didn't happen, did it? So straight away, you were going into the season with the kind of simmering issues and simmering tensions that had been there at the back end of last season, very much still in the forefront. We all know how that eventually unravelled with Mowbray and his job. But what it also meant was Sunderland ploughed on with their kind of signing policy and recruitment philosophy, despite the fact that not just Mowbray, but a succession of managers to that point had argued that it wasn't going to work. And sure enough, it didn't work. The recruitment last summer was pretty disastrous. I think it's fair to say. We all know the 4 strikers situation didn't remedy that at all. There's been flashes from some of the other younger lads that they brought in, but probably no more than that. Clearly, the one difference to that is Joe Bellingham, who I think have to be the standout signing from last summer. And all right, his form's dipped fairly markedly in the second half of the season. But I think an awful lot of that can be put down to the fact that at his age, he's just had to play so much football. I still think that he will turn out to be a really, really good signing for Sunderland. And it's probably no surprise that he's one of the very few signings. Yes, he's very young, but he played championship football. He had some knowledge of what the championship was all about. He didn't have the language barrier to overcome, etc., etc., etc. I don't think it's a coincidence that he's the one signing from the summer that's worked. Now, at the same time, obviously, Danny Bart went, Lyndon Gooch went. Further down the season, Alex Pritchard goes. We all know the issues that's caused in terms of experience, leadership, etc. Again, that's a drum that Tony Mowbray was banging towards the end of last season. So I think one of the big issues for Sunderland this season is that all of the problems that were there at the end of last season were just not remedied. They weren't adequately addressed.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come wrap things up there if you want, Scott, because you've just hit the nail on the head. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, we've spoken again so many times throughout the pod, throughout the course of the season, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I think for me, Job comfortably has been the standout signing. It sort of goes back to the recruitment that me and Joe have spoken about so many times on here. Is they've had a lot of success from academy level of bringing those types of players in. I know Job didn't play at academy level, but I think as well, if we just sort of touch on that part that you mentioned there about him playing a lot of football at this age, he's been shifted around a lot. He hasn't had a consistent sort of starting position. That's something that Mike Dodds has alluded to in his press conferences, saying that for Job next year, can he get double figures? I think if he was able to get double figures, that's another remarkable season, regardless, just because you look at his age. I mean, I come to you, Joe. I mean, who do you think's been the standout performer? It's pretty straightforward, isn't it, really?
Well, yeah. Outside of Jack Clark, I mean, Dan Neil's had a pretty good season as well. But obviously Jack Clark's been the standout performer across the board, really, until he got injured. We came back, we sort of debated it last week, didn't we, whether he was, how fit he was when he came back in. Was it the case of just trying to come back in and get some game time under his belt? But certainly for 6 months, he was absolutely excellent. I think, Mowbray's final game at Millwall, I think that was his 10th goal in sort of 19 games. He was the reason that Sunderland was still in and around the playoff picture before Mowbray's exit. And then obviously, he couldn't do it all himself. I think Scott's absolutely spot on though in terms of going back and tracing things back to that Luton game, because it just feels as though it didn't have to be this way this season for Sunderland. There's a lot of times you'll lose a playoff game and the mood will be very somber. It'll be very sort of one of anger, frustration, disappointment. Yeah, there was a little bit of disappointment, as there would be any time, but there was also a lot of optimism. Sunderland were probably ahead of schedule, I think it's fair to say. And I mean, this week we had the sort of anniversary of that Preston game. And you just think of the mood, the contrasting mood between that Preston game, 6,000 fans going down there and, didn't want to leave. Compare that with the end of the season, this season. It's unbelievable, to be honest, how much it's shifted, and it didn't have to be like that. And I think, the stuff with Mowbray behind the scenes, the succession planning, I just felt that like succession planning's it's a wise thing to do, but perhaps not the way that they did it as publicly as it ended up playing out. Farioli was the one who was linked, wasn't he? Mowbray, after what he did last year, picking up the pieces from Alex Neil, absolutely deserved the chance to progress Sunderland this season. And it always felt as though there was a bit of a standoff within that between the ownership group. So it didn't have to be like that. And then, as you've touched on, with the transfer window as well. But to go back to the question, Jack Clark, without him this season, you do wonder how bad it could have been. Again, you can say that about any top player or top goal scorer in any team across the division, but his numbers consistently for 2 seasons now, 20 goals and assists last season, 19 this season. That's why he's probably going to leave this summer and he's going to get a move to the Premier League, because they talk about the model in terms of bringing players in, with value, and then the ceiling. He's the one who's sort of outgrown or outpaced Sunderland's progression now. He's done 2 seasons back to back. You wonder, I mean, a new head coach coming in could possibly change that. Clark may wait and see what that's going to be like and what the recruitment's going to be like, but he's absolutely one that has played himself into a move because he's outgrown the club almost, it feels.
Yeah, I mean, the Farioli sort of conversation's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I'll open this up to both of you, to be fair. Do you think the club's learned from that? Because if you look back to, obviously, the Michael Beale appointment, that was all very under wraps. Nothing really got out this time around. There's very little out there that we've at least been able to sort of clutch onto or dig up or unearth. Obviously, there's names out there now, and I understand the circumstances are obviously different because you parted company with the manager effectively you've got a free agent or free head coach that you want to bring in. Do you think they've learned from that?
I think they probably. I think they would probably admit that the way things played out at the end of last season, when there were clearly doubts over Mowbray, caused damage. I mean, it's easy with hindsight. In hindsight, if they felt, and they clearly did, that Tony Mowbray wasn't the man for them long term, then he should have gone last summer. When all the issues were there, he should have gone last summer. That didn't happen, so it dragged over into this season. Eventually, they felt that they just had to do it, so they did it. I mean, what you would say from that point onwards is that whether there was succession planning in place or not, their two key decisions, A, appointing Michael Beale, and B, deciding to hand it to Mike Dodds till the end of the season and stick with that come what may, have just not worked. So whichever way they do it, there is absolutely massive pressure on them to get this next appointment right, because we all saw how much damage the Beale era caused and how far Sunderland went back in a pretty short space of time. Well, sitting there at the end of last season, for the final game against Sheff Wed, it felt like, my God, how can it get any lower than this? Well, we only have to look at what's happened with Sunderland over the last 5 or 6 years to know it can get a hell of a lot lower than this if they're not careful. So this appointment absolutely has to be right.
There's that famous Mick McCarthy quote, isn't there, from a press conference? It can't get any worse, and then, it can.
It does feel like that. And again, I agree with Scott, but you look at that. When Mowbray got sacked after that Millwall game, that was the start of sort of a 2-month period where they couldn't really get things much more wrong if they tried. There was the Beale appointment and then everything that went with the Newcastle FA Cup game.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not necessarily on the pitch stuff, but given the magnitude of that game and hadn't happened for so long and the way that it unfolded, that was just, I still sometimes find myself a little bit lost for words how that all played out, to be honest. And I think Beale very much got caught up in that. That wasn't his fault, but, he was an appointment that was not really universally accepted. It was an underwhelming appointment, but he was very much caught up in the crossfire of what was going on off the field with that derby debacle. Obviously the increased ticket allocation, it came out that there was no pushback from that. You had supporters in the North Stand having to move. And I mean, let's not make any mistakes. Those fans in the North Stand are probably people who were, sort of season ticket holders in the Fulwell end, because that when they moved over from from Roker Park, that was probably going to be foreseen as the new Fulwell end. So you're having generational supporters having to move for Newcastle fans of all fans. And then obviously the Black Cats bar stuff. It was just hit after hit after hit, and that for a lot of people will take a lot of recovering from. Managers and form and end of seasons like we've had. Eventually, a new season comes and form changes. That's peaks and troughs, but something like that is lasting. Supporters, Sunderland supporters and Newcastle supporters living amongst each other. That is something that will just go on for a hell of a long time, that we'll be reminded about. So that's going to take a long time for the club to sort of build that trust back up for what they did there. And obviously the Beale appointment and the way that went, as things progressed, the game itself, Beale set up. I think at the time, even in the analysis piece, we sort of said you could tell the disparity between the two teams. So, being 3-0 is not a lot you can do. But then I changed my mind a little bit on that a couple of hours later when I saw Middlesbrough play Aston Villa. Villa competing similar sort of place in the league with Newcastle. And Middlesbrough gave them a really good goal. They laid a bit of a glove on them. Sunderland didn't even raise a hand to Newcastle. They sat off and just totally allowed Newcastle to dominate that game. I mean, losing a derby for any manager either side of the divide it's difficult to overcome. You ask Steve Bruce about that. So he was sort of snookered from that instance, and then the Ipswich game, the whole game where obviously the fan frustration came out as well, and then that led into the press conference that you and I were Scott, where sort of there was the power cut at the Academy of Light, where if ever there was a sign that things were going to go wrong, that was probably it, because then what came out after was the beginning of the end for Beale. When he sort of hit back at supporters, the outside noise comments and things like that, and it just went really, really wrong. Then there was the sort of social media stuff, the accusations at that, how it unfolded at the end as well. It was just a 2-month period where anything and everything could have gone wrong for Sunderland. So then even appointing Dodds, rightly or wrongly, it was, you know, it had gone sort of too far down the road, even though the season was probably still salvageable. I think you can understand why they did appoint Dodds because of how sort of turbulent that Beale era was and the Newcastle stuff. You know, the transition was easier, smoother. You know, Dodds had a good rapport with the squad. So, and obviously he did quite well in the 3 games in December. So it probably did make a little bit of sense. But the way that it then started, heading into the national break without a win, could they have made a decision then? I suppose we'll have to wait and see who the appointment's going to be. If it was someone who they could have appointed in March time, that's when you're going to raise more questions heading into the summer, isn't it?
Yeah, there's loads of good points there.
I think that period you've talked about there, Joe, the kind of Beale era around the Newcastle game period, clearly was a massive, massive tipping point. It was a massive tipping point on the pitch because Sunderland's form, as we know, just dropped off a cliff kind of from that point onwards. But I think more importantly, in the longer term, it feels like it was a really, really big tipping point off the pitch because I think, you know, when this new, it's not even a new regime anymore, is it? When the current ownership kind of group and everything had come in, there was clearly, you know, massive support, real optimism. We all know what had gone wrong under Donald and Methven and that change needed to happen. Increasingly since then, you know, questions had started to be asked. So the whole issue of how much does Kirill actually own, that was damaging. You know, questions over the project, how Sunderland are doing things, the players they've been signing, that's become increasingly damaging. But, you know, I still got the impression that generally Sunderland fans were wanting to back this ownership group and wanting to give them their support and their trust. I'm not sure that an awful lot do anymore. I think that month, 2 month period has caused an awful lot of Sunderland fans to think, do you know what? This lot are just as bad as all the previous kind of bad regimes we've had, and you know what's going on here. Do they understand the club? You know, what are they trying to get out of this? And I think it's really, really difficult to win that trust back once you've lost it. And for all that we talk about what's gone wrong on the pitch, how bad some of the football has been, where Sunderland finished, etc., the most damaging thing to emerge from this season, I think, is the breakdown in relationship between not all fans, but a big group of fans and the board, the club, whatever. And you saw anger at various stages of the season. But I think in that last month, what you increasingly see is apathy. And I think that is more damaging for a football club than anything else. If fans just decide, do you know what? I can't be bothered with this. You know, I don't have a relationship with any of this lot anymore. I can't be bothered with this. That is hugely damaging. We've seen it in the past at Sunderland. We've seen it at other clubs. And like you know, as you said, Joe, the worst thing about it all is it's all been self-inflicted. It didn't have to happen. You know, Speakman and Kirill Louis-Dreyfus and Christian Speakman, to a massive extent, have brought this on themselves. And it's going to take an awful lot of work, I think, for them to dig themselves out of it and turn it around. And
then there's also the transfer window in January as well that I sort of didn't add to that, you know, what was needed or what's been needed for a year in the last 2 transfer windows. They still didn't rectify it. There's 3 players came in where it was either, again, sort of succession planning or a player that they probably didn't really need. So that is, again, you know, that's something that's been continuous over the course of the last 12 months, at least in the last 3 transfer windows, where, again, you say, how long does that faith extend from supporters to that they can get it right? Because, I mean, this summer, you know, you've seen the second half of the season form, it's relegation form. If they don't get the transfer window right, as well as the appointment of the head coach, you know, you wonder if the hangover goes into next season and you start next season poorly, you know, where do you go from there? Because the form was that bad, you know, you can find yourself really in trouble, and the absolute last thing this club needs is to be in a relegation battle in the Championship again.
Yeah, I mean, I just echo sort of everything both of you have just said. I mean, I think, Joe, as you said there, that 2 month period from when Mowbray left through to January, Michael Beale's tenure, stuff that followed, that feels like 3 seasons in one. But still, it's that's the real crux of. I feel like it gave a little bit of an inkling as to where the season was going to end up. That didn't feel like the club as a whole ever really recovered from that. I think, like you say there, the January window just sort of set them up for what we've seen in the weeks that would follow. We'll just quickly pull up some of the obviously, you know, we'll have a few stats over here on We Are Sunderland. So I'll just pull up some of these, which are quite interesting. I mean, we've spoken about the striker issue all season. Now, that's the goals scored by teams in the Championship. Sunderland ranked 17th for goals scored, compared to obviously the likes of Ipswich, Leicester, Southampton, Leeds, who've ran away with it. And that has been the underlying theme, especially when you compare it to goals conceded. For example, Sunderland actually statistically have one of the best defences in the Championship. Now, that sort of lends into Mike Dodds' comment about, you know, the still being in games. It's fair to say they haven't been blown away, aside from obviously, you know, maybe the Borough game earlier in the year, the Blackburn Rovers result. That was a dismal display. But a lot of Sunderland's problems this year has come from the fact that they aren't as fluid as they were maybe last season.
100%, yeah. And we spoke about it this week, didn't we? Just in terms of, you recognise how much, not even just from a goal scoring point of view, just missing that focal point up front. You know, it changes the way you play. And this season, it's been labelled at Sunderland that they're a one-man team in Clark. You know, you can look at sort of the pass maps and the heat maps, and that sort of supports that a lot of their play just is going over to the left, sort of give it to Clark and see if he can do something. Now, sometimes that's might seem a little bit unfair, but in the main, that is how it's felt. And it's been a case of, if Clark then can't sort of do something with it, Sunderland are struggling to score goals, and that has just been a theme throughout. But missing that focal point through the middle, it totally changes the way that you play. And again, I referenced this the other day. If you think back to that Middlesbrough game last season in January, the front four, Clark, Roberts, Ahmad and Stewart. Now, them four didn't get on the field enough really last season because of the injury to Stewart, and obviously Ahmad working his way into things. But at the height of sort of their powers, if you will, that game against Middlesbrough, that is what sort of Mowbray Sunderland were all about. You know, it was excellent the way that they stretched the play. They could play through the middle and down either side. Now, the second half of the season, they combated that with obviously Joe Gelhardt. He, when you look back, he did a really good job, to be honest, given he's not an out-and-out striker. It was felt he was brought in to be a number 10. But then to not address that in the summer, they're trying to do that with a young kid in Joe Bellingham, or a foreign import from, in terms of Adil Al-Shish, who again, we sort of still question where his best position sort of is. It's just never really made up, because the four strikers that were brought in, none of them have been able to fill the void. You know, you've had Burstow, who probably ticked a few boxes. You know, he's one that they've chased quite a lot, but just hasn't worked out at all. Hamir has some attributes to him, but again, the different sort of culture and style of football, clearly a big impact. Rusin, is he that out-and-out forward? You know, Michael Beale touched on that. Is he more of an inside, not of a wide forward rather? And obviously the language barrier and everything that's gone on there. And Mayenda was sent out on loan. So it's just been really, really difficult for Sunderland to play through the middle. And like I say, if teams are able to stop Jack Clark, they predominantly are being able to stop Sunderland this season. And that is a big, big issue. If you think again, last season, the sort of some of the games that they played, sometimes it was almost like a basketball match, wasn't it? Where to the detriment, you know, if teams found them out, they could get hit on the break. You know, you think that Stoke game last year where they got beat 5-1, that was sort of a consequence of how they played. But my God, when they did play that way, it was exciting, wasn't it? And obviously it took them to the playoffs. It worked. This season, it's just strayed too far away from that. Mowbray, in hindsight, he was probably getting the absolute maximum out of the squad that has clearly been weakened since last season, given how the second half of the season's gone. But even he struggled. I think the best run of form was one at the beginning of the season, 8 games, they lost 1. And that was the Cardiff game. You know, last season they were going on. If you think how they finished last season with the unbeaten run, just never felt like they've been able to get that consistency up this season, and that goes back to the recruitment in the summer.
Yeah, interestingly, before I go to you, Scott, if we bring up the goal at Reading, for example, that goal of the season, contender, they've never once looked like they've sort of hit a stride. I'll just bring this up, which is obviously the shot distance. Now, again, you can sort of make of this what you will, because, you know, the average shots there, distance-wise, Sunderland are 4th from bottom. So I think when I looked on it on StatsBomb, it was you know, they tend to have shots from 17 yards out, roughly. Now, from what we've seen this year, just we spoke about the other week, when you had like Ross Stewart in the Sunderland side, you had a willing runner behind to stretch the game, but you also felt like last year Sunderland had a lot more shots in that 6-yard box area and in the box. This year, I feel like, as you say, a lot of it's come down that Jack Clark left-hand side, tends to cut back in onto his right, but we haven't really seen enough of that this year. I think the Nazari Rusin, his goal against, was it Stoke or Plymouth or somebody like that, I can't remember, but there's been we haven't really seen Sunderland stretch sides either.
No, and I think that just feeds into, you know, what we've been banging the drum about all the time, is that they just do not have an 18-yard box centre forward, do they? You know, there's no one in this squad who's kind of, you know, first thought is to either get in behind a defence or make the kind of runs into the 18-yard box that would then lend the likes of Clark or Roberts to be putting crosses in, as opposed to cutting in and shooting, because what's the point of Jack Clark throwing the ball into the box when Mason Burstow's pulling into channels and isn't even anywhere near it, etc., etc. You know, yeah, ultimately it's pretty simple, isn't it? You know, they went for 4 strikers last summer. You know, when we spoke to Christian Speakman, he did say we felt that they were at various stages of their development. Well, whatever stage of their development they were at, none of those signings has worked.
Yeah.
And so surely there has to be a rethink about what they're doing in terms of trying to recruit a striker this summer. Because if they go out again and sign 3 or 4 unproven 19, 20-year-olds from continental Europe, you would have massive concerns about how that's going to play out next season. Now, you know, clearly they're not going to rip the model up entirely. But from what we've been hearing, both on the record and off the record, there does seem to be an acknowledgement that there's going to have to be a little bit of a tweak and a few changes. Well, surely that means that when it comes to trying to sign a striker that is going to go straight into the first team and hit the ground running, then you know, they have to be doing it differently. And that doesn't mean you've got to go and sign a 30-year-old journeyman championship striker. You know what I mean? I mean, look at Borough, for example, with Latalath, who, yes, it's taken him a bit of time, but in the second half of the season, you know, he's looked absolutely superb in terms of a championship goal scorer. Well, he came in from Atalanta, but he was 24. He'd had about 4 different loan moves. He built up a body of work that at least suggested he was capable of playing in the championship. You know, had Mayenda done that? No. Had Hamia done that? No. So, yes, you're signing potential, but at some stage, you've got to say, well, you know, we need more than potential, because if we have another window where we bring in players and it just doesn't work, then we're going to be so far backwards that it becomes pretty much impossible to turn it round then.
Yeah, I think Dodds' comments have been interesting as well, haven't they, in the final sort of couple of weeks, in terms of not necessarily thinking that they need a number 9. If you want my honest opinion, they categorically do. There can be no arguing about that. But I think if you also delve a little deeper into those comments...
I'll just jump in there, Matty. I thought that was worrying. Was worrying because it seemed to be a bit of a let's guide away from the fact that because this isn't what we're going to do. Well, I'm with you. Sunderland need a number 9. They need somebody to lead the line and where everybody else can play off and will be a threat in the 18-yard box and will enable you to play a different way to how you had to play the season. I think if they just bring in another kind of glut of versatile, wide attacking type players, it's just more of the same.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that Dodds said at Watford. He alluded it to himself, that because they don't have a target man to play off, they were forced to try and play out a bit more. They didn't have a target to go along to at Watford and hit there. I think as well, I understand, in part, I understand the comments, maybe in the sense that they feel the right-hand side of the pitch needs to have a bit more impetus. We've obviously looked at this time. I know you've done a couple of bits as well, Joe, when Jack Clark was out injured and who fills his boots. But that's very much where we are this summer. If there's the belief that he will leave the club, it's who fills his boots on that side. It's who fills that right-hand side of the pitch as well, because, we'll get on a little bit about Chris Rigg shortly, no doubt. But he's the only one who's really sort of stamped any authority on that right-hand side of the pitch. We'll talk about Patrick Roberts. He hasn't had his best season by any stretch of the imagination, but it also feels like that right-hand side of the pitch needs strengthening this summer. Now, part of me maybe thinks that that's what Dodds is alluding to, but like you say, it's hugely concerning, the fact that they don't feel like they need a number 9. But again, there's been sort of conflicting messages there. So I'd cite the Watford game as post-match press conference with me as maybe, there is a realisation. I think everyone's well aware that they will change tact this summer. I'm just keen to pick your thoughts on that, on that right-hand side of the pitch and up front, Joe.
No, I think, yeah, it's a good point. I think across the 3 spots, there needs to be investment, doesn't it? Like if Clark's going to go, the money that they'll bring in, the windfall that they'll bring in from his sale, has to be reinvested in all 3 areas of that pitch, of the top end of the pitch, because, like you say, Roberts' form this season has been concerning, to say the least. He hasn't looked the same player. You look at the chance that he missed last week against Sheffield Wednesday and the chance that he missed at Watford. They were chances that were going in last season. You wonder how much he misses Ahmad. The sort of partnership that them two forged up last season was breathtaking at times. But he struggled obviously a little bit with injuries, been unlucky with a couple of hamstring injuries and calf injuries and things like that. But he hasn't, at the moment, like you say, that right-hand side, the shirt is absolutely open and up for grabs, and Chris Riggs made a good impression in that role. I also wonder how much the sort of this desire to play Trey Hume as an inverted fullback has impacted things as well. Whether he's getting whether Roberts, that is, if it is to be him on that right-hand side, is getting as much sort of joy and support on that side of the field, with Hume sometimes or often drifting in field. We've sat up in the stadium, haven't we, a few times this season, noticed Hume almost in the centre forward position, and you're wondering kind of what's going on. Sometimes I just want my back four to be my back four almost, and my full back's going up and down rather than in and out. Look, I'm not a coach or anything like that, but sometimes you just think it's been overcomplicated, particularly under Dodds in the 13 games towards the end of the season. But yeah, to go back to the question, I think right across the forward line needs investment. You need goals out of there. There's only been Clark who's hit double figures when it comes to goals and assists this season. I think Dan Neil's second with 9. That in itself tells its own story. Last season, I think there was 5 players who had double figures. You had Clark, Stewart, Ahmad, Roberts and Pritchard. Pritchard was Sunderland's highest assist maker for a large part of the season, and he left in January. Again, just tells its own story. I mean, Neil's obviously, he's trying to combat that, but he's playing in a much deeper role. So then do they need to bring a number 6 in to move him a bit further forward, to make him a bit more creative? There's a lot of things that need to be sort of ironed out, and they need to decide which way they're going to go here in terms of where personnel they're going to play it and sort of a system that they're going to play as well. Those 3 forward areas absolutely key.
I mean, it's something that we spoke about, isn't it? At the Sheffield Wednesday, we spoke about exactly that. As it feels like we sat there 46 game out of 46, and I couldn't tell you Sunderland's starting 11, the nailed on strongest side, and that in itself has been a huge issue. I think you can make an argument either way for formation and shape. I think with Dodds' final few games, he was trying to balance solidity with going forward. But we spoke about it, Joe, didn't we? The fact that we're at the last game of the season and we all don't have the same sort of team written down in front of. Well, I get, from game to game, you can tweak things slightly. But for me, that was it. They need a strong summer to nail down this identity, philosophy, how they want to play, what shape they're going to play.
Absolutely. I think, you could, I think the 3 of us would probably, we might struggle to name the same starting 11 who would pick our formation and things like that. And after a 46 game season, that absolutely shouldn't be the case. You should know what you're going to be going with, or certainly then when you get to January, for example, what you need to play in the identity or the philosophy that you want. It seems like they favour that 4-2-3-1 at times, but there's been a 4-3-3 variation. It's like you spoke about Joe moving in and out of position. There's been too much fluctuation, sort of not cohesive enough. Yeah, last season we saw plenty of rotation with the likes of Ahmad and Roberts, but they're players where you're almost entrusting them, or Mowbray was almost sort of saying, right, go on, you just give them the ball and let them go and do their thing. This time, we asked the question, didn't we, the other week? You wonder, are they almost being overcoached? Is it a case of that freedom and that license being taken out of them a little bit? Or is that flair even there anymore? Big question marks. And you've got to think that the recruitment, they've got to sign players that the head coach has got to have the identity of, right, saying this is the way that we want to go, and then bring me the players that are going to fit this system that I want to operate, rather than it being a little bit scattergun. I mean, you think of the January one, Styles being the perfect example. He plays at international level as a sort of a holding midfielder. He came in as a sort of a wing back for Sunderland. Now, I know that there's been issues defensively there with Serkin and Huggins' injury and Elise, but you go and bring a left back in rather than someone who's rather like a defensive midfielder. It just seemed a little bit off to me, and they need to nail that down in the summer.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Dodds himself said that he didn't really know what position was his best position. Scott, if I come to you now, it may not be over coaching, but it certainly feels like the difference in coaching. Dodds has mentioned it again in his post-match press conferences, pre-match press conferences, the number of coaches they've had this season. Now, I know Christian Speakman came out after Mowbray left, and it was, we're appointing a manager who's, Sunderland identity, basically. We have a style of play. The head coach shouldn't really matter. This season has only shown that it does matter. It is a huge, huge component. And next season, again, I asked Dodds this in his final one about final press comments about stability. Next year, there's so many issues that need addressed this summer, but we go at the head coach just to start with. I mean, it's massive, isn't it?
Yeah, and you make a good point there, which is that, the kind of the overriding message that we're given about this kind of project, whatever you want to call it, that Sunderland are kind of trying to enact is that it should be, there should be an overriding identity, playing style, ethos, whatever you want to call it, that means that if players leave, if head coaches leave, whatever, the thing rolls on and the upheaval is kept to a minimum. Now, there are clubs, Brighton is probably a very, very good example, where it does kind of feel a bit like that. Brighton change head coaches, but ultimately what they're doing in terms of bringing players in and the way that Brighton pretty much play does continue, and there is stability at that club, even though people come and go. So I think to a degree it can be done. But what we've seen so far is Sunderland, I don't think, have brought in managers who really fit that model. There's been so much talk about it and so much kind of, this is the guiding light. Well, Alex Neil never really felt like a really comfortable fit for that. Tony Mowbray clearly by the end wasn't a comfortable fit by that because he had grown thoroughly exasperated by his lack of influence and lack of being able to dictate and control things. I guess Michael Beale wasn't there long enough. We don't know how he would have actually fitted into that. But in all other ways, the appointment was a disaster. So, for all this talk of this is how we're going to do it, this is what we're doing, I just don't feel that the managerial choices that they've made up to this point have really fitted particularly seamlessly into that. So, it's going to be fascinating to see where they go next, because there are managers on the kind of list that we're talking about and that we know that there's a bit of interest in and that are clearly out there that do feel much more comfortable fits for that kind of model. So, potentially a Will Still, potentially a Rennie Marriage. But they come with massive risks because they've got no experience in the Championship. They're very young. Yes, they've built up a reputation, but are Sunderland going to go fully down that route? Because it's always felt like that's the route they really want to go down. But up until now, Alex Neil and Tony Mowbray, in many ways, were the complete opposite of that. So, are they actually going to put their cards on the table and kind of do this? Because, I keep coming back, you do feel that's the route they want to go down. Or does a Liam Rosenior, does a Paul Heckingbottom still become a more attractive option because of the body of work that they've built up? But I look at both of those managers, head coaches, whatever you want to call them, and I think there's the potential with both of them for the kind of issues that we saw under Neil and Mowbray over a lack of control and a lack of actually being able to drive the thing. It feels like that might be an issue with both of them as well.
It's interesting because we spoke about this yesterday, didn't we, Matty? It's almost like trying to strike that balance between what they want or what they see and kind of what works or what has traditionally worked for Sunderland. I mean, Scott, you think of the managers that have worked at the Stadium of Light over the years, Roy Keane, Peter Reid, Sam Allardyce, Mick McCarthy, real sort of figures like that, like managerial figures, Mowbray, obviously.
Yeah.
The head coach route is very much different from that, isn't it? So it's a case of they need to go all in on their policy or sort of go with what's kind of worked in recent years. That's how it feels to me.
Yeah, and like I say, Beale is probably the closest to what you feel that they want. But it just unravelled so quickly that we never really got the chance to see how a Michael Beale appointment, for example, would have played out in a transfer window. what degree of input would he have had? Would he be telling us the type of players he wanted, or would he very much just completely be, I'm the coach, I get what I'm given, I'm absolutely fine with that? It all unraveled too quickly. We never found that out. But it still comes back to that with me, that, if you're going to have a head coach that has very, very little say over recruitment, which seems to be the way that Sunderland are operating, certainly what Tony Mowbray was telling us, then you need someone who is absolutely on board with that, knows without any shadow of a doubt that that's the parameter, and doesn't just say, I'm happy with that, but actually is used to working like that. It feels to me like you either need to change the model or you need to get someone who is absolutely 100% aligned to that. And I don't think Sunderland have done either of those up to this point.
Yeah, I think they're all very good points. I think for me, just to add my 50p, 20p to this, I think, like you say, if you look back historically at what Sunderland have done, who they've appointed, especially under this new ownership, they've appointed the likes of Alex Neil, Tony Mowbray, Michael Beale again. I actually think, and again, this sort of ties into what Mike Dodds said the other week about, at least from the outside looking in, the model looks, the murky waters, they're not clear, which is why the appointment and the signings this summer should give a big indication, because in theory, they need to clear this up. So for me, I feel like I agree with you, Scott. I feel like it's all fair and well saying, look, we have alignment, we have clarity. As much as, you can discuss Michael Beale's short tenure, I still don't think that was the right fit. I don't think he got the club. I don't think he got the fans. But the hierarchy themselves, I feel like they've got caught up a little bit in the short-term goal and the long-term goal, because, we mentioned Brentford, Brighton, for example, earlier on in this, and they got promoted that way with those types of managers already in place. And I felt like they got that right, which then in turn brought success. Whereas I feel that somewhat at Sunderland, Alex Neil was brought up to win promotion. I don't think they brought him in to develop players by any stretch of the imagination. I know he did do that in his previous role. Tony Mowbray was, he's got such a good background in developing players. He's one that they have appointed that you can maybe say, well, that did go with what we want, but not in the sense of how we're going to do it, because there still needs to be a fine balance. I think, like you say there, Scott, it wasn't clear, or at least it hasn't been made clear to head coaches, maybe what the exact route that they're going down. I don't know. Obviously, we're not party to sitting in those sort of chats, but it certainly feels like they've maybe got stuck between the short term and the long term aims.
Yeah, and I think you make a very good point there, which is, for me, the fundamental clash, if you like, in everything Sunderland are doing at the minute, which is the imbalance between, we want to be a club that develops young players, signs low and cheap, sells high, reinvests. It's a long-term project. We want to build the club. We want to be self-sustainable, all of that. But we want to win promotion. Well, yeah. If it was as simple as you sign a load of young players, you develop them, and you win promotion, every team in the Championship will be doing that. It's a no-brainer. If you could click your fingers and do it, we'd all do it. Well, everything that Sunderland have done over the last 2 or 3 years has shown it's not as simple as that. It's a really, really difficult balance to strike between bringing in a load of unproven, cheap, young players and trying to develop them, at the same time winning promotion. That for me is at the core of everything that we're talking about with Sunderland, because where does that, how do you strike that balance? Which way do you tip it? Does it go more one way? Does it go more the other way? I don't think Sunderland have come up with the answer to that yet. And it may be because there isn't an answer and you cannot do it. You've either got to do one or the other. Christian Speakman is absolutely adamant that's not correct, and you can do the two things at the same time. Well, let's see. Up until now, I would suggest the evidence suggests that you can't have the best of both worlds. Maybe you can.
The evidence does suggest that, though, doesn't it? I mean, the piece that I did the other week, there's only 2 teams who've had one of the 2 youngest squads in the division in the Championship era who've been promoted. Sunderland were one of them under Mick McCarthy, and Wolves, I think, in 2009. both had the second youngest squads and went up automatically. They're the only two examples in the Championship era. Leeds had the second youngest squad this season, missed out. So it's, historically, having the youngest team in the division doesn't get you automatically promoted. Now, again, that's not to say you have to go out and buy all these 30-plus-year-olds. It's just having that balance. It's having that balance, But it does seem, I agree with Scott, it seems as though they're really set and married to the idea of trying to achieve success with the youngest squad, with the youngest potential head coach. If it was to, it will still come in. There's something that the youngest owner in Kira Louis Dreyfus. There's something that sounds appealing to them for them to do that, but it's going to be really, really difficult, as history suggests, to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got nothing wrong with. I think the model in itself is actually a very logical way to go about things. You buy players for cheap, young, develop them, sell them on potential. That only works if the club progresses at the same time. We don't have a very large data pool, really. They won promotion first year, playoffs last year. This season, we'll see in a few years where we end up. Is it an anomaly? Will it work? There's so many questions. For me, again, it's something that I've sort of banged the drum on this pod. And, this youngest team in the division, yes, it shows that you're giving players opportunity. But what does it even mean? You don't get an award. There's no money for handed back to clubs for fielding however many young players. Before I end up going on a rant off on that one, we'll touch on some of the youngsters who have impressed this year. And for me, Chris Rigg just stand out. We did a tweet that went out in a Facebook post just on somebody who's overperformed. For me, I don't mean that in a negative way. It's thoroughly surpassed my expectations. He was thrown in against Leicester for his first start, and dear me, 16 years old. That boy's an incredible talent. He will, in my opinion, play Premier League, and if not, for England one day, I think.
Yeah, it seems that way. I think what's most telling, and we've said this a few times, is that he doesn't look out of place. Yeah. That's the best compliment you can give someone who's 16 years old. He's coming to that team, like you said, again, his first start against Leicester, a Leicester side who have been promoted, won the title, but who were clearly littered with Premier League players in the squad, and he didn't look out of place against them. And that's pretty much continued throughout the run-in of the season, to the point where next season, if they get the contract signed in the summer and he's still here next season, it's not even a case of him just being a fringe player or dropping him out. He's in your starting squad. Like, there's no doubt about that. He is in your starting squad and very possibly in your starting 11. I don't think anyone would be disappointed to see Chris Rigg in the starting 11 on the first day of next season, and that is the biggest testament that you can play to him. It's obviously the development and things like that is going to be key, how they manage him, because he is a young player. We've seen with Job this season, you don't want to burn them out at such a young age, because he for 6 months he did have a good season, so that will be key. But the talent is clearly there, and we spoke about, and Mike Dodds mentioned, didn't he, about playing him over on the right to then eventually move him into midfield, and you can see that you could see him sort of taking over the role of Dan Neil if Dan Neil was to go and get a move, for example. So he's one that is certainly one for Sunderland and supporters to be excited about, and for us to sort of be able to cover that and watch his journey as well, because he's come into it and he's just totally thrived. And you see the success of the academy. Me and Scott spoke about this the other day. There's a couple there as well who you're thinking, can they kick on next season and being in and around the squad as well? So that aspect of things, that the academy level and how that's been developed and nurtured and looked after what it had been neglected, really, hadn't it, under the previous ownership. That has absolutely been a plus point. And that's, look, we speak as though it all needs thrown out of the window this summer. I don't think it does need root and branch surgery. It just needs some tweaks here and there, and they can. So it's not unsalvageable what's happened over the last 6 months. But we go back, like what we were saying at the start of the show, there was a lot of trust broken over this season, and that is going to be important how they do that. And Chris Rigg is someone who will help do that. Getting him tied down and making sure his future is here at the Stadium of Light is something that will be one obstacle to get people on board.
And I feel like I've spent the entire hour just knocking kind of Sunderland and everything that's been going on and everybody. But I think with Chris Rigg, keeping him at the club and developing him the way that he has been developed so far is a massive feather in the cap for Sunderland. And if you're someone like Chris Rigg, then surely you're looking at the way Sunderland are operating at the minute and thinking, why would I be desperate to get away from this club at the minute? Because they're going to give me a chance. Young players are going to get a chance at Sunderland. And if you're a Chris Rigg or a Tommy Watson a little bit further down the line, that has to be a massive motivation factor for you, both in terms of your development, but also when it comes to making decisions over your future, that Sunderland is a massively appealing football club at the minute for any young player. And so, I would be really optimistic about Rigg staying and being a massive part of what Sunderland are doing next season. And as Joe said, on all evidence so far, he is ready to become a Championship regular, which seems staggering given that he's not he's still a school age kind of kid. But that's where we're at with him. He absolutely is ready, and he is going to be hopefully a massive part of Sunderland's future, and bringing through the likes of Chris Rigg and giving him genuine chances at first team level in the Championship is a massive positive of the way Sunderland are doing things at the minute.
And I do think as well, just to quickly jump in there as well, they are still an attractive proposition to sort of a Premier League academy youngster. We saw with Ahmad coming in last year. Burstow, I know it didn't work this year, but he was highly sought after in the summer. I think AC Milan were one of the clubs who were interested in him, and he chose Sunderland. I don't think this season will impact that reputation from sort of Premier League clubs thinking or being a bit wary of sending their youngsters or prospects to Sunderland. I still think that is an avenue that they can tap into, and that again is credit to the club for doing that. But again, it's just about getting the right players in and around them, because not all of them are going to work. You're not going to get an Ahmad every time. You'll be lucky if you get Ahmad another time, to be honest. But someone like a Burstow, who probably did tick a lot of boxes, like I said before, and who did have interest in the summer, there will be other examples of players like him where they'll come in and they will be able to do a job. You see it quite a lot in the Championship, and Sunderland still, I believe, would have the reputation of being a good place to send a youngster like that.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I don't think, like you said, I don't think they need to rip up the model, but there's certainly aspects that they need to, learn from, and that experience is one. You touched on some of the youngsters there. It all brings us sort of full circle to this summer and what needs to happen this summer. The head coaches we've spoken about at length, and we'll continue to be on top of that over the course of the summer. Obviously, we'll bring you pods on Mondays and Fridays, unless something breaking happens. We'll restore our Wednesday pod. But just on the summer and potential opportunities for youngsters, Matty Young's another one. Tommy Watson, there's Ollie Bainbridge is impressed. Harrison Jones signed a new extension. There are plenty of reasons to be positive on that front, aren't there, Joe?
Yeah, there is. They're excelling at the moment in the 21s. They've got the International Cup to look forward to next year as well. They're an environment that is thriving at the minute, and you're seeing with the likes of Rigg coming through, jumping the age groups, Watson jumping the age groups. There is talent in there, and that hasn't been something that has been the case. Well, it has been, but they've been sold off rather. When there's been good players who've come through the academy, they've been sold off in recent years, and this time, and again, that's something else that you can say at the ownership group. They seem very set in their ways and determined that they will not let players go for sort of a substantial fee, and that's right the way through the levels. So in that aspect, yeah, that there is plenty to get excited about. But again, you've got to, we're speaking about the age. You said it there. You don't necessarily win an award for that. Every supporter and us as covering the club, you love to see youngsters coming through homegrown talent, but it's about doing it at the right time and putting them in an environment where it's not going to damage their careers at an early stage. Because, and I think that was one of the things with Watson this season. If you were throwing him in towards the end of the season, it could have potentially had a bit of an impact, like it could have done with Rigg. It is sink or swim, isn't it? But it just felt at times, if you're throwing someone in that Blackburn game, for example, or the Bristol game, that could be difficult for a young player who's only used to sort of under 18s football. So, but yeah, it'll be interesting. What will be interesting is in pre-season how many of them are included in the first team squad in Spain, and I think the youngsters are going out into Italy. It'll be interesting to see the split of those and where some of them go on. But obviously, the recruitment beyond that is going to be key.
Yeah, definitely. We'll draw things to a close there nicely. We'll have one final push for our Black Cats Bar season ticket. That's now been extended until 2 weeks' time on Friday. So that's the, what is that, the 24th. Yeah, if you've watched over on YouTube, please don't forget to subscribe. It's just £1, obviously, to enter the Black Cats Bar season ticket competition, and you can get 6 months worth of brilliant coverage. We've got tactical analysis, insight from former players, expert opinion, and we'll be all over the ins and outs of Sunderland in the summer. Thanks for joining me, Joe. Thanks for joining me, Scott.
No problem.